it's a pleasure to see so many of you here. Concerned staff, concerned supporters, and people from the Korean public who are interested in the issues that we find important and that we focus on as an organization. So thank you for being here this evening. As Jumbo has mentioned, this is the 20th anniversary of the GHI. We cheat slightly because the first 3 years we called it the Challenge of Hunger, and it was only in 2009 that we changed it to be called the GHI. And we produced it initially because we wanted to bring together an analysis of global hunger with recommendations as to how hunger could be addressed. And what I found very important in Jumbo's closing remarks is that we know how hunger can be addressed. We are simply not doing it. And that's something that I'll come back to and touch on. So if you look at the title of this year's GHI, it comes in two parts. So the first part, 20 years of tracking progress, relates to the fact that this has been going for 20 years. But the second part is probably the more important part, where it calls on us to recommit to zero hunger. And that concept of zero hunger is taken from the second Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 2, which all governments committed to achieving by 2030. And currently we're nowhere close to achieving the vast majority of those SDGs. And that's a reflection of the lack of political commitment to making real change. Between 2000 and 2014, really, there was a very significant decline in the level of global hunger. Between 2014 and 2016, it disimproved, things got worse. And in the period from 2016, while there have been improvements, they have been slow and they have been geographically uneven. So we see increasing levels of hunger again currently in Africa, while there are significant improvements in Asia and in the Caribbean. The reality, according to I'm not just going to talk about the GHI, I'm going to talk about other reports that cover the same ground. So the UN's most recent SOFI report, looking at the state of food insecurity for 2025, so that 8.2% of the global population is food insecure. And the World Bank has noted that if we address food insecurity early, it has a massive difference. $1 invested in preventing hunger is the equivalent of saving $23. So we know that action to prevent malnutrition can have a consistent and significant cumulative impact. We also know that if there is a global commitment, we can actually reach that ambition of SDG 2, of achieving zero hunger. We need to make sure that we don't let that opportunity slip away, because that's what's currently happening. And I was asked to look specifically at the relationship between conflict and hunger, because these are concerns two primary areas of work. So in 2025, it was estimated, or it is estimated by the UN World Food Programme, that 318 million people are acutely food insecure. They're not just hungry, they're acutely food insecure. And these are in 68 countries. But 3/4 of these people, 75% of them, are in contexts that are affected by conflict. And hunger due to conflict has more than doubled in the last 5 or 6 years, between 2018 and 2023, which is the analysis from the World Bank. And we know and we consistently see that conflict undermines food security, because food resources, food production, the methods and means of production are consistently targeted in conflict. It results in the reduction or the degradation of agricultural assets, because again, they are often targeted. It causes the displacement, death, and injury of food producers, traders, and consumers. So the whole food system becomes undermined and becomes weakened as a result of conflict. And conflict is currently the largest driver of displacement. So today we have a record number of people who are displaced, either as refugees, moving to another country, or as internally displaced people, people who have been forced to flee but stay within their own country. So currently there are more than 120 million people displaced, primarily as a result of conflict, but the impact of climate change is now also driving displacement. 60% of those people are internally displaced within their own countries, and therefore removed from the social security networks that often support them. But the recent hunger hotspot report from the 2 UN agencies, the World Food Programme and our colleague here, Donald's own organization, the FAO, identifies 6 countries that are acutely food insecure. And we know that famine has already been declared in 2 of these, in parts of Sudan and in Gaza, parts of the occupied Palestinian territories. But there are 4 other countries that are also of extreme concern, and 16 countries altogether that the WFP and FAO are concerned about. And all of the countries of greatest concern are countries that are affected by conflict. And conflict is generally characterized by forced displacement, the destruction of food systems, and the denial of humanitarian access. So anyone who has been following what's been going on in Gaza and in Sudan knows that it's very, very difficult to get sustained delivery of humanitarian support into conflict and disaster-affected populations. So this is a very significant challenge for us. Concern's own research, so early last year, we released a report sort of analyzing the link between conflict and food systems. And we focused on 3 countries in particular: Haiti, Sudan, and Somalia. And the conclusions were not unexpected, but we made a deliberate attempt to try to gather information and data to support what we already believed. Probably poorly phrased, which the evidence that we gathered supported what we currently believed. So if you looked at what conflict was doing to civilian populations, these are the top 7 issues that were identified: increased cost of food production, the collapse of livelihoods, the breakdown of markets, the blockage of aid delivery, reduced capacity to produce locally, gender inequality, which I'll come back to, and inflation. And taken together, all of these drove an increased level of hunger. But gender inequality is something we must continue to focus on, because women are generally disproportionately affected by conflict. Mothers must provide for their children. They face extraordinary dangers to secure food. They're often displaced, very often without their husbands, and they have to carry a high level of responsibility for keeping families together. And I'll give you a specific example of this in a minute. So if we move down from the global level and we talk about the national level, and we talk about one of those countries that WFP and the FAO are warning about as being acutely food insecure and faced with the potential of famine. South Sudan is the world's youngest country. It was established or given its independence from Sudan in the middle of 2011. And almost since it gained independence, it has been in conflict, a rolling cycle of conflict. And currently, nearly 2/3 of the population of South Sudan face severe hunger. That's 7.7 million people. Famine warnings are in place from the Integrated Phase Food Classification System that identifies the level of food insecurity. And 2.3 million children are at risk of malnutrition. That's a scale of malnutrition that the humanitarian system will not realistically be able to address in a timely manner, and that means children will die. And that's the reality of what we're currently looking at. And its nearest neighbor, Sudan, is facing the largest humanitarian crisis in the world today. It has fallen back into civil war and into chaos and is forcing mass displacement internally and externally. But it's important that we consider the impact on the individual, because it's only by looking at individual stories that we understand what's really happening. So this is a slightly anonymized case study, so we've changed the names of the mother in question and of her child who's in our selective feeding program. But this lady, Nyanuba, was displaced in 2022. She was displaced with her husband and 7 children. And they were forced to displace because of huge flooding. But then in early 2023, heavy fighting started in the area that they were living in, and they were forced to displace again. And for people being displaced in contexts like this, it means that as much as they can carry is as much as they can take with them. So she took the tarpaulin that was the roof of the shelter that she was staying in, that had been distributed in 2021, so it wasn't in great condition. And that was the main thing they were able to displace with. So people are leaving with the clothes on their back and very little else. Displacement in conditions of conflict is brutal, and unless support can be given to them, often life-threatening. To get to her nearest water point, she has to walk for 40 minutes, which is easy if you have an empty jerry can and increasingly difficult when you're carrying that weight of water back. And she has to do that every day. Food deliveries, because of the funding crisis, are reduced in frequency and quantity. So life is becoming increasingly challenging. And it's essential for the humanitarian community and the political community that we address conflict, because it is the primary driver of needs and of displacement. Famine, and I've already said there are 2 instances of famine, and there are 4 more areas where famine is threatened, are a failure of the international system and the international aid system. Famines take years to reach their peak. They don't happen overnight. So if we don't respond in a timely manner, we know the consequences of it. Governments and humanitarian actors must prioritize and invest in approaches to food insecurity that protect livelihoods before conditions reach catastrophic levels, which is where they're currently at in too many places. What we see in too many contexts is that international law, and especially international humanitarian law, is being violated. It must be upheld. And those who use hunger as a weapon of war must be held to account. So I couldn't start with anything in Korean, but I can write that much even if I can't pronounce it. Gamsadnida, something like that.